Welcome to my channel, and today I want to share a story that will grip you from the first word. A tale of betrayal, vengeance, and a young woman's journey through danger, where every choice could mean survival or disaster. In the fading orange hush of late evening, when the dust of the unpaved road still hovered in the air like restless spirits searching for a place to land, Kafele stormed into my compound without knocking, his voice rising before the wooden door had even completed its slow swing inward, barking at me as though the chaos scattered around my room had personally offended the sun itself, asking if I seriously believed any human with sense left in their bones would allow such disorder to grow like weeds around them, comparing the mess to the back corner of Mama Nuru's roadside kitchen, the left side by the crooked mango crate, the one customers always avoided because a pot of agusi once spilled there and the stain never washed away, insisting. It looked as if my life had turned into some forgotten bowl of beans nobody wanted to claim. And he kept staring at me like he was waiting for me to crumble into dust, the same way the old plaster on the veranda had been crumbling for years. Then muttered that I had said I needed something simple done, that I had called him with urgency, as if the world itself had tilted, and I told him I didn't need simple. I needed something resolved, completed, ended with no leftover questions, and I needed it now, this moment, not tomorrow, not when the moon changed, not when the harm had grown new roots. I told him clearly, without trembling, that I wanted them gone, every last one of them. That woman included, her entire household, every person tied to that bloodline, every whisper of that name. And I wanted them erased from the path of my life so completely that not even the wind could carry the memory of them back to me. And Kafele froze like I had shoved him toward the edge of a cliff. No one survived, asking if I had any idea what I was truly demanding, if I understood the depth of the well I was pointing him toward. And I told him he could manage it because I had seen what he was capable of. Because Kafele walked in shadows others feared, understood the quiet corners where things slipped out of sight forever. And I reminded him it was just the two of us, like always. Like when we were children sneaking past the elders' huts to catch the stories drifting through the night, and he knew the strings to pull, the pathways to walk, the doors that opened only when danger called their names. And he rubbed his jaw, releasing a breath that seemed to pull half the air from the room, then said he understood, motioning for me to step inside fully so we could talk where no ear waited in the cracks. And once the door shut behind us, he lowered his voice to the kind of hush used for confessions and calamity. Asking whether this fire in my chest came from that day I struck that woman, the one who believed her pale skin gave her ownership of everything she stepped upon. And the memory struck me again, with the same blunt force it had carried the day it happened, pulling me backward to a time when the heat of the sun felt heavier because of the weight of humiliation. And I remembered my mother, my fierce, steady mother, who once struck a wealthy trader named Madame Sarah, a woman older than her, respected by some but feared by many, and my mother never apologized because she insisted the woman deserved every bit of it after provoking her with poison-laced words, and Mama always believed in defending us first, explanations later. The world second, and I remembered asking her if she believed me, if she trusted my version of events when trouble came crawling toward me like a snake seeking the warmth beneath the doorstep, and she told me she always did, without hesitation, without debate, without needing to search my eyes for confirmation, because her trust was not something I earned. It was something she gave as naturally as breathing. And she told me that if I ever saw that cruel, sharp-tongued, bitter-hearted woman again, I should shout her name with every drop of air in my lungs, and she would arrive before the echo had time to fade, ready to strike again if needed, ready to shield me as she always had. And Mama told me no one on this earth would ever harm me as long as she lived, and her promise wrapped around me like armor, shaping the way I saw threats, shaping the anger that simmered beneath my ribs whenever someone reached too close. And standing there now in the dim, clay-walled room with Kafele's eyes fixed on mine, all that inheritance of fire rose to the surface once more, pushing me with a certainty I could not swallow, a certainty carved from my mother's voice, urging me to finish what had begun, to ensure no one who came after me or mine would ever find another chance to do what had already been done. The lantern flickered between us, its small flames swaying as if unsure whether to stay alive in the thick silence that followed my words, and Kafele paced slowly, his bare feet brushing through the dust on the floor in soft, steady circles, the way he always walked when his mind sharpened like a hunter's blade. And he finally asked if I understood the path I was forcing open. A path where once a foot stepped inside, it could not step back out unchanged. But I told him the change had already begun, the day they crossed a line no one touched without consequence. And he stopped pacing just long enough to study me, as though searching for the fractures in my resolve. And when he found none, he exhaled, long and low, saying the truth was never as simple as removing people from the earth, that consequences stretched further than the hand that delivered them. But I reminded him that consequences had already arrived at my doorstep wearing the shape of shame, pain and insult. And he nodded like someone who had known from the moment he entered that he would agree, and he finally sat on the edge of an old stool, its legs uneven from years of use, and told me we would need more than anger. We would need precision, timing, and quietness. The kind of quietness that swallowed footsteps and dissolved questions before they formed. And I told him I was ready for whatever path the night demanded. And he chuckled, without humor, telling me readiness was a myth people clung to so they wouldn't admit fear. But fear was already sitting in the corner beside us, listening, waiting. And I told him fear did not matter because I had survived worse. And that only made him tilt his head, not in judgment, but in memory. Because he had been there through many of those moments, had held the wounds that others caused, had watched me gather myself piece by piece. And he finally leaned forward and asked for the full story. Every detail of the insult, the strike, the humiliation, the moment the air shifted inside me until vengeance felt like a destination instead of an emotion. Because he said he could not stand beside me in this unless he understood the root of the fire that was pushing me forward. And I hesitated. Not because I wished to hide anything from him, but because recounting the story meant reliving it, letting every sting land again, and yet I knew there was no turning away now. So I closed my eyes briefly, gathering the memory like one gathers broken pottery shards, sharp enough to cut through the skin, but too important to leave scattered. And I told him it started on a morning when the sky was still soft, when the air smelled faintly of rain. When I had gone to the market to buy yams for my mother, carrying her old woven basket, the one she had used since I was a child, and I had no reason to expect trouble. No reason to expect that a woman like Adaora, yes, that was her name, a name many claimed carried dignity but I knew carried nothing of the sort, would step into my path, her voice raised, her chin lifted like she believed the road belonged to her alone. And she accused me of pushing her, accused me of disrespect, accused me of being ungrateful, loud-mouthed, unmannered. And she spat words sharp enough to pierce bone, calling me a thing, as though I were not human at all, and she reached out to shove me again, harder. And something in me snapped like a rope, pulled too tight for too long, and before I could think, my hand struck her cheek. And the sound echoed louder than it should have, silencing half the market for a moment, and people turned to look at us, some stepping back as though the possibility of lightning had entered the space. And Adaora clutched her face, eyes wide, not from pain but disbelief that anyone had dared respond to her. And she told me she would not forget, that her household would not forget, that I had just opened a well of trouble I would not be able to close. And I walked away, because looking at her face made my anger boil all over again. But I did not know then that her people would come searching, that her brothers would murmur threats in corners, that her cousins would follow me for 2 days as though hunting for an opportunity, that rumors would begin floating through the market that I had lost my mind, that I did not know my place, that I had embarrassed the wrong woman. And when they cornered me behind the tailor's stall near the water drums, surrounding me with smirks and laughter, telling me to kneel and apologize, or they would teach me a lesson. The fire my mother gave me rose so fiercely inside me that I refused, and though I fought back, though I clawed and kicked and swung, they were too many, their hands too strong, and they left me on the dirt behind the stall, covered in dust and humiliation. And the whole time I lay there, I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me no one on this earth would harm me while she lived. But she was not there, and her absence tore through me like a blade. And that was the moment something hardened in my chest, something deep and immovable. And I swore that even if my mother was not standing behind me, I would become the version of myself she had raised, the version who did not let people walk free after spilling harm on her, And when I finished telling the story aloud, my voice shaking despite my effort to still it, Kafele did not speak for a long moment, and the lantern light cast his face in uneven shadows, but when he finally looked up, his eyes held a dark understanding, a heavy agreement, and he told me that what Adaora's people did was not small, not something brushed aside like dust from a mat. And if they had chosen violence first, then the door they had opened was theirs to answer for. And he said quietly that he would stand with me, not because vengeance was easy or righteous, but because what was done to me demanded balance. And he rose from the stool, straightening his shoulders, saying we would begin at dawn. Because dawn carried the kind of silence that disguised movement and erased footprints before anyone could follow them. And he told me to rest, though. Rest was the last thing my mind could hold. But I nodded anyway, knowing the path had already formed beneath our feet, and whatever waited ahead would not turn aside, simply because we wished it to. The night crawled slowly, refusing to pass quietly. As if it knew dawn would bring movement neither of us could retreat from, and I lay on my thin mat with my eyes open, listening to the restless rustle of leaves brushing against the clay walls, each sound reminding me of footsteps, of whispers, of the memory of Adaora's people circling me like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to stop moving. And sleep would not take me because my thoughts kept circling the same burn in my chest. The humiliation, the promise I made to myself, the certainty that no forgiveness lived in this story anymore. And sometime after midnight, when even the roosters had grown silent and the stars seemed to shiver, I heard Kafele's quiet steps return to my doorway, and he did not knock. He knew I wasn't out to sleeping, and he entered carrying a long, cloth-wrapped bundle that he laid gently beside the lantern, which he lit with practiced hands, the flame rising slowly as if learning the air again, and he said he had gone to visit someone he trusted. Old Senatoro, a man whose age made people forget he once moved through the night like a shadow with a heartbeat. And Senatoro had offered advice, warnings, and something wrapped in that cloth, something he said we might need if the night turned against us. And though Kafele did not open the bundle yet, the weight of it pulled the air down around us like a held breath. And I asked him what Senatoro had said. But instead of answering immediately, Kafele sat, elbows on his knees, face lowered in thought, before telling me that Senatoro had listened to everything, every detail, and then told him that revenge was a river that could not be stopped halfway, that once we stepped into it, the water would decide where we ended up, not our intentions. And Senatoro had asked whether we were prepared to accept that truth, and I asked what Kafele told him. But Kafele only said that Senatoro had known him for too many years to ask twice. A man like Senatoro could hear decision in the breath between words, and he heard it in mine, and he gave Kafele instructions, names, warnings, paths through the night that few people walked anymore. And then he pushed the cloth-wrapped bundle toward him with a stare that said, "You cannot return to the version of yourself that existed before this." And when Kafele finished recounting this, he finally lifted the edge of the cloth, revealing not a weapon carved for war, but a small gourd with deep red markings, and beside it, 3 pieces of charcoal wrapped in dried plantain leaves. And I stared at them in confusion, expecting steel or something more direct. But Kafele explained that Senatoro believed the conflict was not only physical, but spiritual, that those who carried cruelty in their blood sometimes called upon protections unseen. And if Adaora's family had ties to old practices, as many families in the neighboring villages quietly did, then we needed a shield that moved in the same invisible spaces. And though I had not planned for anything like that, I nodded. Because instinct told me we would need every form of protection the world would give. And I asked him how we would use those items. But he said Senatoro had given instructions he would share at dawn, not before, because night carried spirits that listened too closely when plans were spoken aloud, and he let the cloth fall closed again, as though sealing away the weight of what we would face. And he leaned back, his shoulders heavy, telling me that before anything else, he needed one final truth from me. Something I had avoided giving completely, something deeper than the story of Adaora's arrogance or her family's violence. He asked me to tell him what I feared most, the thing that gripped my heart beneath all the anger, because he said vengeance, born only from fury, was wild and unpredictable. But vengeance born from truth, fear-faced and named, was sharper, steadier, harder to break, and I sat there in the half-light, the shadows stretching long across the walls, and for a long moment, I could not speak because the question dug into the part of me I rarely let myself see. But he waited without forcing me, and eventually, I whispered the truth I had not spoken to anyone. That what I feared most was becoming helpless again, lying on the dirt behind the tailor's stall, tasting dust and shame. Knowing that no matter how loudly my heart screamed for justice, no one had been there to answer. Not my mother, not fate, not the world that claimed to uphold fairness. And that the image of myself on the ground, powerless and exposed, haunted me more fiercely than the faces of those who hurt me. And saying it aloud made my voice break in a way even injury had never broken it. And the lantern flickered as though reacting to the confession. And Kafel raised his head slowly, his expression changing. Not pity, never pity, but something like unshakable commitment settling in his bones. And he said that fear was valid, rooted in truth, born of real harm. And he promised in a voice stronger than any oath that he would not allow that image to become my reality again, no matter the cost to him. And something inside me loosened. Not the anger, not the resolve, but a tension I had been clenching since the day Adaora first raised her hand toward me. And in that moment, though I knew the path ahead was dangerous and stained with choices we would not be able to undo, I also knew we were moving as one, bound by purpose, by pain, by memory. And as the first thin grey line of dawn touched the window, Kafele rose, retied the cloth around the bundle, and told me it was time to prepare. Because once the sun lifted itself over the horizon, the first step of rebalancing the world would begin. By the time the sun spilled gold across the red dirt paths outside, the village seemed unaware of the storm brewing in our hearts. And I moved with Kafel through the narrow corridors between clay huts, each step measured, each footfall swallowed by the dust, as though the earth itself was conspiring to hide us, and I could feel the weight of the gourd and the charcoal wrapped in plantain leaves pressing against my ribs, a constant reminder of the task ahead, and of the unseen dangers lurking in places where words could not reach. Kafele's hand occasionally brushed mine, not in comfort, not in caution, but as a signal. A tether that reminded me that while my anger fueled the movement, his experience would guide it, and he whispered directions that only the walls and shadows could hear. Names of allies hidden in plain sight, paths that avoided the eyes of Adaora's family, and warnings of where the land itself might betray us, where sand shifted like betrayal, where stones held grudges, and I followed because there was no other option, no turning back to the life of innocence and unchallenged vulnerability I once believed I had. And as we approached the small compound at the edge of the village, where rumors told of Adaora's uncles gathering in the cool shade of mango trees, plotting retaliation, I felt the first real pulse of fear, sharp as the tip of a spear, threading through the armor my mother had built around me, and I breathed, slow and deliberate, repeating her words under my breath as a chant. No one on this earth would ever harm me as long as she lived, and though she was gone, I carried her essence like a shield. And Kafele stopped suddenly, signaling for silence, and I froze, listening to the faint creak of wooden shutters and the soft shuffle of bare feet on packed dirt. And he pointed toward the rear of the compound, where a narrow path led through banana trees that brushed against our arms. And he explained in hushed tones that the charcoal and gourd would be used at the precise moment, in alignment with the rising sun and the patterns of the wind, to mask our presence, to confuse those who would seek us, to make the world tilt subtly in our favor. And I nodded even though the mechanics were unfamiliar, because trust had long become our language, and I knew Kafele had walked these shadows longer than any of us could remember, and he crouched first, signaling me to follow. And as we slipped into the banana grove, I saw Adaora herself, moving between the trees, her posture proud, her voice carrying a melody of command, as she spoke to men I had never seen before, some unfamiliar, some old enough to remember my mother's name and her reputation. And my stomach tightened, a coil of anticipation and rage. And Kafel whispered my next steps, which I executed without thought, every muscle, every nerve, tuned to the rhythm of silent strategy, and then the gourd was placed. The charcoal lit, the smoke curling in thin lines that danced upward and mingled with the sun's first rays. And immediately I felt a shift, the air thickening in a way that bent perception. And Kafele motioned me forward, past the trees, past the back walls, past the men who did not yet see us, but were already influenced by the unseen forces we had called upon. And the compound opened before me like a map I had memorized in dreams, and I moved as though carried by memory and vengeance together, and every sound seemed amplified. The creak of doors, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of footsteps. And when Adaora finally turned toward me, recognition and surprise lighting her eyes, I held my gaze without hesitation. Because the fear that had once trapped me on the dirt behind the tailoress stall had been replaced with something heavier, steadier, rooted in certainty that the scales would be balanced, and I saw in Kafele's eyes, just behind mine, the same fire, the same readiness, the same understanding that we would see this through to the end. And when my hand reached for the first action, I remembered my mother's voice again, like the wind guiding the dust. Strike with certainty, protect what is yours, allow nothing to weaken you. And the memory of that lesson, carried through years of shadow and trial, surged through my veins, pushing every doubt aside as I stepped fully into the world that demanded justice, not mercy. And the compound, once silent and deceptively peaceful, became the stage where every choice, every breath, every movement mattered. And as Adaora's men shifted, sensing something amiss, I moved with the precision Kafele had drilled into me, the knowledge of the gourd and the charcoal weaving invisibly around us, creating uncertainty, bending perception. And I realized fully that this was no longer about fear or humiliation, or even about revenge alone. It was about claiming control, about taking the future back from those who would wield cruelty like a weapon. And with each passing second, I felt the past and present colliding. Every insult, every strike, every whisper that had once shaken me now propelling me forward, into a confrontation where only resolve and cunning would determine who remained standing. The moment stretched like thick sap dripping from a wounded tree, slow yet heavy with inevitable fall, and as Adaora's gaze locked onto mine, the air between us tightened until it felt like even the dust particles had paused to watch. And her eyes, once so full of unearned confidence, flickered with something she had never allowed herself to express in public, uncertainty. Yet it vanished quickly beneath a mask of disdain she wore as easily as jewelry, and she lifted her chin, commanding the men around her with a single glance. But the smoke from the gourd and the charcoal had begun to twist the air in subtle, disorienting currents, causing the men to hesitate, their movements slowed by the confusion that slipped beneath their skin like whispers they could not decipher. And I stepped forward, feeling the strength of my mother's lessons settle into my bones like an anchor, grounding me, even as my heart thundered in my chest, and Adaora opened her mouth to speak, likely to hurl some insult sharp enough to split the morning in two. But her voice wavered in the thickening haze, and Kafele, standing slightly behind me, murmured directions so quietly they blended with the pulse of the earth beneath our feet, guiding my steps toward the center of the compound where the first confrontation would unfold. And as I stood in the open, the heat of the rising sun pressed against my back like encouragement, and the men surrounding Adaora shifted in a semicircle, trying to appear intimidating. But their eyes darted between the curling smoke and the unbroken resolve in my face, and I realized they were not prepared for what was coming. They only knew how to bully, how to swarm, how to humiliate, but they had never faced someone who came for them by choice, someone who walked toward danger without flinching. And Adaora, sensing their hesitation, stepped forward to reclaim control, placing herself directly in front of me, her wrapper swaying with the morning breeze, her bracelets clinking lightly, and she said with forced calm that she did not expect to see me so boldly, that only a fool returned to the people who had taught them fear. And I answered with a level voice, telling her that the only fool standing here was the one who believed fear would keep a wounded heart silent. And her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see the crack in her composure, before she snapped her fingers at two of the men nearest her, signaling them to move. But the gourd's magic twisted their instincts, making them step slightly off balance, their feet unsure, their vision clouded by brief, dizzying confusion. And before they could recover, Kafele moved like dusk shadows slipping between the folds of daylight, his hand striking a pressure point Senatoro had taught him long ago, sending the first man crashing to his knees, breath knocked from his lungs, and the second stumbled backward into the wooden railing, gripping it as if the world had tilted. And Adayora took a step back, not out of fear. She would never admit to such, but out of shock, her carefully crafted certainty unraveling thread by thread. And I told her that the humiliation she handed to me behind the tailor's stall had not faded in the dust as she expected, that the bruises she left on my memory had not healed quietly, and she laughed. A sharp, brittle sound, saying that a single slap and a moment of roughness should not have driven me to madness, that I should have known better than to provoke her in the first place. And hearing her rewrite the truth so casually, so arrogantly, reignited every ember in my chest, turning them into fire that roared through my veins. And I stepped closer until our faces were separated by no more than a breath, telling her that she was not facing the girl she cornered in that dusty alley, not the one she mocked and dismissed, not the one her cousins pinned down with cruel amusement. She was facing the version of me her cruelty created, the version forged in humiliation and strengthened in silence. And the words struck her harder than any slap could have, her eyes narrowing with recognition that the power she once held had slipped from her grasp, replaced by something beyond her control. And she snapped her fingers again, louder this time, summoning the remaining men who had not yet been disoriented by the smoke. But Kafela was ready, stepping forward with movements fluid as water, redirecting attacks before they fully formed, using training older than many in the village remembered, and the compound erupted into a tense, breathless clash of shadows and bodies moving in hot morning air dust rising around us in frantic spirals, voices mixing with grunts, footsteps, and the unpredictable sway of smoke that bent perception like heat above a fire. And through the chaos, I kept my eyes locked on Adayora, each of us circling, measuring, deciding, and in her gaze I saw something I had never seen before. Hesitation, anchored by fear she refused to admit. But beneath that fear, deeper still, I saw a dangerous spark. The kind of spark that came not from guilt or remorse, but from a person who believed the world still owed her obedience. And I realized with chilling clarity that this confrontation would not end with one blow or one fall. It would require a reckoning, complete and undeniable, because Adayora was not simply an antagonist in this story. She was a force molded by entitlement, sharpened by years of unchecked arrogance, and unless fully broken, she would rise again, dragging more harm behind her. And as that understanding settled into me like iron cooling into shape, I felt the fire in my chest align with purpose, steadier than rage, sharper than fear, ready for the moment the final clash between us would arrive. The air in the compound thickened as the men surrounding Adayora faltered, one by one, under the subtle influence of the smoke and the precision of Kafele's movements, and I moved closer, feeling each step pulse like a drumbeat of inevitability, my hands steady, my eyes fixed on her, knowing that every hesitation she felt now was a product of the path she had forced me onto. The humiliation she had handed down like a crown, and Adaora's breathing had grown slightly uneven, the controlled rhythm of her arrogance unraveling. But she lifted her chin stubbornly, the same posture she had worn in the market, and spoke with a voice that trembled just enough to betray her. She said the past did not define her, that no single act could shape the woman she believed herself to be. And I replied sharply that the past never defined her. It only revealed her, and everything she had allowed and perpetrated had built the image before me now, a woman bound by cruelty and pride. A woman whose power had been unchecked for too long, and Kafel stayed slightly behind, silent and watchful, guiding me with the smallest nods. And when Adayora stepped forward, attempting to reclaim dominance, I anticipated her move, sidestepping and using her own momentum against her. And for the first time, I saw genuine fear flash across her face, sharp and quick like a bird startled from the branch, and she shouted orders to her men. But the confusion from the smoke and Kafel's precise strikes made them falter, stumble, question, hesitate, and the compound became a swirling blur of action and anticipation. Every breath I took, measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of the confrontation. And as I circled Adayora, keeping my movements deliberate, I remembered the day behind the tailor's stall, the dust in my mouth, the weight of her insults pressing down on me. and I let that memory sharpen my resolve instead of dull it. And my hands moved, not blindly but with intention, striking, deflecting, redirecting, until one by one her men fell into retreat. Confusion etched across their faces, as if the world itself had shifted beneath their feet, and Adaora's gaze flickered repeatedly between them and me. Realization dawning that the chains of her past arrogance had become the instruments of her own undoing, and she lunged at me with desperation, swinging wildly, trying to reclaim the narrative. But my body moved with instinct, honed by years of preparation, by nights spent plotting alongside Kafele, by fire stoked in the memory of my mother's unwavering protection. And I caught her arm mid-strike, twisting and holding firmly, and she struggled, teeth gritted, eyes wide, and I whispered that this was the reckoning she had invited, the moment where consequences became undeniable, and her voice cracked, shouting threats that sounded empty against the weight of the reality closing in, and I felt no triumph in her fear, only a deep, resolute satisfaction that justice was taking form. Not in hatred alone, but in the unwavering assertion that she could no longer harm me, could no longer dictate the terms of my life. And as Kafele moved to secure the final men still resisting, I held Adaora firmly, looking her in the eye. And I said that the days of mockery, of unchecked cruelty, of others enforcing her pride on those weaker than her, were over, and the compound fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the labored breathing of those who had faced the force of precision, courage, and preparation. And in that quiet, I realized the depth of transformation within myself. I was no longer the girl who had trembled in the dust. I was the woman forged by trial, by fire, by the knowledge that protection could take many forms, and that vengeance was a tool when wielded with focus. And as Adaora sagged slightly in my grip, her defiance slowly replaced by reluctant understanding, I knew that the story we had entered together, the one of humiliation, fear, and revenge, was reaching its pivot, the point where balance would be restored, the moment where the scales finally, irrevocably tipped. The compound seemed to hold its breath as the dust settled, sunlight spilling unevenly across the ground, catching the fallen men in sharp relief, and I kept my grip on Adaora, feeling her tense muscles slowly relax, not entirely, but enough that I knew the fight within her had shifted from aggression to realization. And Kafele moved to stand beside me, his presence steady, a reminder that we had not only survived the first wave of chaos, but had emerged organized, controlled, prepared. And I glanced at Adaora, whose chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, her eyes darting between the empty spaces where her men had once stood, now scattered and disoriented. And I spoke, quiet but firm, telling her that every insult, every cruelty, every slight she had imposed on me, on my family, on the memory of my mother, had shaped this moment, and that the balance was being restored. And she said nothing, only swallowed, her jaw tight, shoulders slumping as though the weight of realization finally pressed down upon her, and Kafele motioned for me to release her arm, which I did slowly, deliberately, keeping my gaze fixed on hers to ensure she understood the power she had lost. And as she stepped back, I felt the tension leave my body in waves, though not entirely. Because the path we had walked was not one of ease or simple victories. It was carved from struggle, preparation, and the careful application of knowledge that only years of survival could teach. And I watched her gather herself, straightening her wrapper, adjusting her hair, trying to reclaim the image of authority she had once worn effortlessly. And I realized that some lessons could not be given gently, that some reckonings demanded fire to temper the steel of arrogance. And Adaora's eyes met mine again, no longer blazing with entitlement, but narrowed with a cautious respect, though unspoken. That her world had changed, at least in this corner, at least in this moment. And Kafele approached, quietly securing the remaining men, guiding them away from confrontation without further injury, without unnecessary spectacle, and I felt the satisfaction of justice tempered by control. The kind that taught without annihilation, that balanced power with restraint, and I stepped forward, taking a deep breath, the morning air heavy with dust and the faint scent of charred plantain leaves carrying the magic and protection we had invoked. And I spoke again, my voice carrying across the compound, telling Adaora that the story she wrote with cruelty and fear had come to its natural end here, that her choices had consequences, and that the lives she sought to dominate would no longer bend beneath her weight. And she stood there, silent, listening. And for the first time, I felt the depth of my own transformation, the quiet yet unshakable understanding that I had walked through fire, that I had faced the ghosts of my past humiliation and emerged steady, stronger, and ready to live in a world where my dignity could no longer be stolen. And as Kafele and I stepped out of the compound together, the sun, fully risen now, casting long, golden shadows across the red earth, I felt the finality settle around us, not in triumph, not in vengeance alone, but in the measured, enduring restoration of balance, the kind that honored my mother's memory, respected the power of preparation and courage, and acknowledged that the fire within me, once fueled by fear and pain, had been transformed into a force capable of shaping my own destiny. The village around us resumed its rhythm slowly, the sound of children laughing in the distance and the low murmur of elders discussing the day weaving itself back into normality. But I knew nothing would be quite the same after the morning's reckoning. Adaora and her men had been humbled, not destroyed, and in that restraint lay the true measure of our power, the kind that ensured the scales would remain balanced without leaving the world hollow and bitter. And as Kafele and I walked back along the narrow paths that twisted between clay huts and drying maize, the gourd and charcoal safely returned to their resting place, I felt an unfamiliar lightness settle over me. A quiet affirmation that the fire that had burned within for so long had now been channeled, directed, tempered into something steady and resolute, and memories of my mother rose in me. Not the sorrowful ache of her absence, but the fierce warmth of her presence, the echo of her promise that no one would ever harm me as long as she lived. And though she had gone, her lessons had not. And I realized that the version of myself forged in dust, humiliation, and struggle had been tempered by justice, by cunning, and by the loyalty and skill of someone like Kafele, who had always understood the shadows, the quiet corners, and the paths no one else dared walk. And as we approached my own compound, I saw the sun fully over the horizon now, painting the red earth gold. And I knew that this light carried not only the start of a new day, but the symbol of survival, of reclamation, of strength earned through trial. And Adaora's face returned to me in memory, no longer filled with the arrogant cruelty that had defined her, but a sober awareness that actions carried consequences. And I smiled faintly, because this was the lesson my mother had taught me, refined and enacted fully, that power without fear, tempered by wisdom, could restore balance without losing humanity. And Kafele clapped my shoulder lightly, a silent acknowledgement of what we had accomplished together, and I stepped into my home. Finally, the chaos of my room waiting for me. The small disorder of daily life, harmless compared to the tumult we had navigated, and I allowed myself a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the earth, the weight of history, the strength in my own spine. And I knew that while life would continue, while new challenges would inevitably appear, the core of who I was had been solidified in the fires of experience. And for the first time since that day behind the tailor's stall, I felt entirely unshakably certain that no one, no matter how cruel or arrogant, could ever again strip me of my dignity or my power. And as the morning stretched out before me, the dust settling, the sun rising higher, the village moving forward in its quiet rhythms, I realized that the story was no longer about fear or humiliation or revenge alone. It was about strength reclaimed, justice tempered, and the enduring truth that the fiercest protection comes not from fleeing shadows, but from walking into them, fully aware, fully armed with courage, and fully prepared to shape one's own destiny. This story is more than just a tale of revenge or confrontation. It is a reminder that our past does not define us, but the courage we summon in the face of injustice does. No matter how deep the shadows, strength, wisdom, and determination can guide us to reclaim our lives, protect what we love, and rise stronger than ever. Let this story inspire you to face your own challenges with resolve, to stand tall when others try to push you down, and to remember that the fire within you is the most powerful force you will ever carry. If you like this story, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share with your friends and family so you don't miss the next powerful story coming your way. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting story videos.